It's random thoughts again. In this video, I'm going to start going through the diary of the man who shot Koitalel Arap Samoei. His name is Richard Meinertzhagen. So I had planned to start going through a different document. And the document I had planned to go through first is the Eastern Uganda an ethnological survey by W. Hobley. That's the document I wanted to go with first. But then somebody in the comment section of one of the videos that I published recommended this document. He mentioned it and I decided to have a look, and then I have a look and it seems like it has a lot of interesting information, especially because the person who wrote this diary is the person who did something that we can say changed the history of Kenya in a major way. Now, the way this guy comes to Kenya, this Richard Meinertzhagen, is he was a British guy, but of Jewish ethnicity, and he goes, is recruited and is posted in Burma, and he stays in Burma for a while. He doesn't mention in the diary how long he stayed in Burma, but he starts by telling us what happened in Burma that made him to come to East Africa. And he tells us that one day he went out with one of his seniors, and he took one of his seniors out to do some shooting, something like that, and then they missed a church parade. Turns out that during that time in the British military, there used to be what was called a church parade. They missed that, and then he comes. He's given a dressing down, and he doesn't like it, and he rage quits, and he decides to leave Burma, and he takes a ship that comes to East Africa. He tells us it's a German ship, and he travels. Even from his records of the journey from India to East Africa, you start seeing a very complex kind of a guy, because in the ship, there is an incident that happens there where the German crew were mistreating a monkey or a baboon that they owned, and they were giving it a lot of alcohol, tying it up on the pole and laughing about it, burning it with a cigarette and things like that. And he was angry about it, and at some point they had tied the monkey to somewhere in the ship, and it was so drunk and it was so in pain, and he decides to end it, and he cuts the rope that was tied, and the animal falls into the sea. Now that creates, you start seeing this guy is some very complex character, because here he's talking about him not, and in fact he says it, that I don't tolerate cruelty of any kind to animals. But this guy was very cruel to human beings, to Africans, and a lot of that is in the diary. And he, of course, he was from a different, we can say a different generation, because he doesn't mask his disgust and dislike and contempt for the people who lived on this land. He calls them savages. He uses the N-word a lot. He describes them as useless, who know nothing, and they are not reliable. They have a mentality of children. Those are his words to describe the Africans he found here when he came in 1906, according to his diary. This diary was actually published as a book in 1957. Now, from the introduction, he justifies his violence. And to quote him, he says, "A soldier enters a fight to come out on top in the shortest possible time, and any means to achieve that is justified." He also says, "Inflicting heavy casualties on enemies will shorten the duration of a conflict. It will teach a lesson and result in a more enduring peace than less violent measure." So those are his very initial words in the book, which is a diary that was published as a book. Now, of course, we know the story of him taking the skull of Koitalel Samoei. We can see the head of Koitalel Samoei back to Britain. But it turns out this was not his first time doing that. Immediately arrived in Mombasa, and then he took a train to Nairobi, the very first few days, he does collect some skulls from nearby villages, and he describes them as skulls he found of Maasais who had died out of lack of food, hunger, or famine that was there at that point. And he picks these skulls and he goes with them to his house in Nairobi. He's still very new. He's a few days old in Nairobi, and he keeps them there. And then he says that he later on sent them back to Britain. So seems like it's something he enjoyed doing, and it's hard to understand why he was fascinated with skulls, but anyways, that's something he did. Now, beside being a soldier, this guy describes himself as an ornithologist, which means someone who studies birds. And from him arriving in Mombasa, he shows a lot of interest in the birds. And he talks about the birds, but he comes inland and he's surprised that there are so many birds that he doesn't know, he's never seen. And he kind of like complains in his diary that he didn't get a book that was going to guide him about the birds that he was going to come across. Now, in his diary, just a few days after arriving in Nairobi, of course, he is sent to be part of the King's African Rifles Battalion in East Africa, and they had a base in Nairobi. And he's sent there, he's given some rank there, and he started seeing things that he didn't like. And one of those things is that most of the British officers that were there had African girlfriends, and he didn't like that, and they used to bring these girls to the mess. And he didn't like that, and he told them to stop, and they told him they didn't care. And he threatened to write a letter to the superiors about it, that these people were bringing Africans into the mess. And they stopped because of that. But the way he describes it, these people did not like him because of he was interfering with how they had lived before he came along. And then there is another part in the diary that shows how of a conflicted person this guy was. While he calls Africans useless and having a mindset of children and being incompetent and all those things, when he arrives in Nairobi, he realizes that when the African soldiers were erred or made a mistake, they were flogged mercilessly. And he didn't like it, and he complained. He said, I don't want any African soldiers under my command to be flogged. It's not going to happen. And that stopped. His soldiers were never flogged. He didn't like it. Of course, we also know that this guy shot Koitalel Arap Samoei in the head or on the head. Shooting on the head or in the head is something that seems like he liked doing a lot, because in the diary he mentioned so many times him shooting animals in the head. It's like he liked it, putting it in the head. Such language he uses a lot in the diary. And even when describing what other Europeans did in East Africa, when they went hunting, he liked saying, oh, he should have put one on the head, or he put one on the head. So it seems like it's something he liked, he really enjoyed doing. Not long after arriving in Nairobi, Meinertzhagen Richard, his name is, he travels to Fort Hall. That used to be a long distance. That's from Nairobi to Murang'a. Murang'a used to be called Fort Hall then. And they walk, of course, they trek. There were no roads or vehicles or cars. It took them a few days. And his travel to Fort Hall has some interesting stories there. He talks about the lions. He tells us stories of them sleeping near River Ruiru, which was interesting because it's a place I stay. I'm reading this book, and River Ruiru is not very far. And he talks about the lions that came at night, and at one time they picked one of the people he was with, and the lions escaped with that person. And in the morning they found a place in the bush where they basically ate the man. And he talks about attack by local tribes, and he mentioned some tribes that, because the assumption is River Ruiru, that will mean that the people who lived around were basically Kikuyu, and he does say that, but he does mention that there were others who lived there. For example, he tells us of people he describes as the Merauka tribe, and they were very violent, very warlike, and they lived around Thika, that place. And then he tells us about some interesting characters, or he tells a story of some interesting characters he comes into contact with. For example, he tells us that at Fort Hall, that's Moranga, there was in their camp, next to their camp, there was this chief. He was called Chief Kinuthia. Now, Kinuthia was a very interesting character. Kinuthia used to organize wine drinking parties, Moratina, at his place, just next to the camp. And he will invite other men and they will drink at night. And at some point, they can become very chaotic, and then they will start shooting arrows into the camp and then shouting to the soldiers at the camp that they were going to kill them at some point, things like that. And then in the morning, they will go for him and he will start saying, oh, no, you know, we were so drunk. Don't take that to be, we were not serious. We were just having fun and we drank too much. And then we said things that we shouldn't have said. And they will find him some goats and he will go back. And then a few days later, he will repeat. In his diary, Meinertzhagen does predict, after looking at the Kikuyus, the likes of Kinuthia, that the Kikuyus were going to be very difficult to control. He says that. Now, that was 1906. And in fact, he does tell fellow British soldiers, the people he was with, that these people are going to be difficult to control. And he tells them, specifically, he says, once these people get education, they are going to be trouble. They are not going to be easy to control. They are going to revolt. They are going to fight you people. That's what a conversation he had with one guy. He tells us that he was a high commissioner by the name Charles Elliot. And he says he tells Charles Elliot that Charles Elliot tells him about the plans of the British, and he tells him that in a few years, this whole land will be occupied by white people. We will have it so developed. All these highlands will be occupied by British farmers, and we'll be doing a lot of farming here. Then he tells him at the end of it, these savages are going to chase you out of here. And Elliot disagrees with him, and they disagree on that point. While he saw that these people are not easy to deal with, Elliot was like, we plan to put them in reserves, which indeed were created later on. That's where the name reserve come from. People say, oh, I'm going to the reserve. Reserve were these places that were created where Africans were supposed to go and stay, so that the rest of the land is open for the British farmers and British entrepreneurs to use. He also gives us stories about, or he also writes down some other interesting stories. For example, there's this Chief Karurie. Now, Chief Karurie became a victim of some conmen who were British guys and some Italian guys. One of them was a guy called Boyes. Now, Boyes was a British guy. Boyes comes to Chief Karurie and tells him he wanted to be his friend, a partner in business, and he tells him to give him his stock of ivory. And it seems like Chief Karurie had a lot of that. And Chief Karurie trusts him and gives him the ivory. It was a lot of ivory, according to what this guy writes. Boyes goes with the ivory to Mombasa and disappears, and he goes back to Britain. He sells the ivory somehow. He makes a lot of money. And he started telling people in Britain that he was the king of the Kikuyu people. So there are so many of those kind of like funny stories in his diary. And he says that there were this other guy who was called Smith. Smith comes with some Italian guys who claim to be fathers, priests, but they were not. And they were basically stealing from the locals, lying to them, cheating. Meinertzhagen doesn't like it. He specifically says these people are going to damage the prestige of the white man in the eyes of the savages. That was his worry. His worry wasn't that these people are doing something wrong to the locals. His worry was this was going to make the locals maybe realize that these are just human beings like the rest of us. They cheat, they lie, they steal. They are just basic human beings. That wasn't that was his worry, not that they were stealing or doing anything. And indeed, he did have them arrested and taken to Nairobi, and he requested that they be deported from Kenya. He also tells us that he did talk to Chief Karurie, and Chief Karurie was telling him about the origin of the Kikuyu. And Chief Karurie tells him that the Kikuyus were brothers of the Wakamba and they were brothers of the Maasai, that they are from the same ancestor and they just, everybody went their own way. But he claims that the Kikuyus, the Maasais, and the Wakamba were from the same ancestor. That's what Chief Karurie told Meinertzhagen. Now, he also talks of him and some other white guy going to meet Lenana. Lenana was like the paramount chief of the Maasai, and he goes to meet him, and Lenana is with his brother Sendeyo. Now, Sendeyo was kind of like the chief of the Maasai in Tanzania, but at that point, Sendeyo is here in Nairobi, Ngong, and is with his brother because the Germans had chased him away. And Meinertzhagen meets him and meets Lenana, and Lenana promises to provide them with soldiers and things like that. And then as they're about to leave, Sendeyo kind of like comes, talks to them on the side, and is like, you know, I can give you even a better deal than what my brother is giving you. That's what he writes, and he says these two seem not to be in very good terms, the way they talk to them in separately. But together they seemed like they were together because Sendeyo had come to, in fact, to stay with his brother because he had been chased away from Tanzania. Now, that's just the beginning of this diary. Of course, the main event that I'm looking forward to is the murder of Koitalel Arap Samoei. I'm interested to see how he portrays the story from his side. Of course, he's going to lie, or he lied, because he said that he did it in self-defense, but all the evidence that is there is like he didn't do it in self-defense. He tricked Koitalel into a meeting, murdered him alongside his entourage. But I'm going to read the diary and see what he says about that. Those are my random thoughts.